Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I would like to discuss how, although the government negligently refused to carry out impact assessments for Brexit, well, now that it's here, the National Audit Office is measuring the impact as it hits and has just released a report on the state of our borders. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So we have two types of Brexit border, of course, really. That between Britain and Northern Ireland, which may be thrown into chaos in the next week or so, and that between Britain and other countries where the government are conspicuously silent. You know, this creates the impression that the border between Britain and Northern Ireland is the problem. That's the one that's not working, when the actual problems are between Britain and everywhere else. Although EU countries are meeting their international obligations and applying third country systems to British imports into their territories, Britain is not doing the same in return. But this isn't a problem just for the rest of the world, but for the UK as well. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary and current darling of the Conservative Party faithful, wrote a letter over a year ago to Cabinet colleagues to warn about the serious risk of smuggling and loss of trust from other countries if we did not get our borders operating quickly, after leaving the transition period. At the time, we were not going to have it in place for the end of the transition period, so we're going to have a 6-month period of limbo where we'd left the single market but had no border to manage our imports. But our border wasn't put in place in July either. Some checks were supposed to come online last month and the rest in January 2022, and now those have been extended as well. Basically, we have neither a plan nor a timetable to get our border sorted as far as I can tell. And the National Audit Office's latest report concluded that the current EU GB border model is not sustainable. The report said that our current model is not sustainable. Now, on the Northern Ireland border, it uses some diplomatic language that made me smile. It said that the UK government's position is that there are unsustainable challenges when the grace periods end. They didn't say that. The National Audit Office didn't conclude that that border was unsustainable. They concluded the GB-EU border was unsustainable. But there's probably not much point picking at the details of the Northern Ireland border right now, because the report has been published just at the time when those arrangements may be thrown into flux very soon. So taking a look at the other borders, in terms of the headline figures in their report summary, they picked out a 23% decrease in UK trade due to COVID and Brexit, which I'm actually not going to make too much of. I've talked about drops in trade in the past. I certainly haven't compared the first quarter of this year with the last quarter of last year. That's nonsense. You have more trade in the last quarter of a year anyway. Not worth making that comparison. You'd expect it to be down in a normal year. The fact is that it's down on the same quarter in previous years. But the next two show the extent of the red tape that Brexit has brought us. The first one, clear. 140,000 export health certificates signed by officers in the first 6 months of this year. Now think about the costs needed to fill in the paperwork for those certificates, then have someone check and sign it. Those people don't work for magic beans. They need paying. Those are additional costs on the exported goods. The government bang on about how we have a tariff-free trade deal with the EU, which is not entirely true as it happens, because if goods do not meet origin rules, they're still subject to tariffs. And that's going to be a big problem next year when the paperwork is required, the next phase of Brexit. But tariff-free doesn't mean free trade. So we're now paying more money to export our goods than we did a year ago, which means that our goods are enriching our economy less. Because it can come in different ways. You know, if it could be that the business absorbs those costs, in which case they're making less profit, then that means they'll pay fewer taxes. But if the costs have to be passed on to the customer, which is in the EU, those goods are also less competitive and then fewer of them will be bought. Again, they make less profit. There was also another headline figure about 48 million customs declarations up to August of this year. They compared that to only 44 million the whole of 2020. Now, normally that would sound quite bad. You'd go, okay, in the whole of last year, there are only 44 million. Now we've had to do 48 million just up to August. For goodness sake, what's it going to be like in the last 4 months of the year when you've got the bulk of your trade? But I would consider that a meaningless comparison right now, because last year, COVID hit our exports for a while. It would be better to compare it to pre-Brexit and pre-COVID years. So back before any of this happened, we used to have to fill in about 55 million a year. 55 million customs declarations. So what we really need to do is to see how the figure stacks up at the end of the year, for the whole year. We know it's going to be more. I mean, it's already 48 million before we even get to the final third of the year where you get most of your trade. It's going to skyrocket over 55 million. But we do need to wait for the end of that year. And then what's more interesting is what it's like next year and then the year after, as more Brexit systems are factored in. Because remember, we didn't get Brexit all in one go. You know, it didn't get done in one. Johnson agreed to phase it in over time. And the timetable for doing so has already been delayed multiple times as well. So we're not even sure what the timetable is. But what we are certainly going to have is more paperwork needed to export our goods. The report makes clear that this is already the case. And that means we are now less competitive in our main export market, even without considering the problems of transport. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the breach of World Trade Organization rules. You know, those WTO rules that the Brexit supporters were cheering for. I have a question. If Brexiteers love tight borders and WTO rules so much, how come our borders are more open now than they were and we're breaking WTO rules? The report makes clear that we have to maintain import controls to make sure that we do not treat the EU more favourably than the rest of the world. But currently we do. Like, our borders were set up to apply the necessary checks on goods coming in from outside the single market. No problem, got that set up, that works, that's fine. However, the bulk of our trade comes directly and indirectly from EU countries. We're not set up to deal with that. We don't have the staff to cope with the massive workload required. If we had the staff, we don't have the facilities to house them to carry out this work. And if we had the staff and the facilities, we don't have the new import systems to cope. We're still using the decades-old system that has not been adapted to cope with our new trading arrangements. And it will never be adapted because it's not intended to be adapted. We're supposed to have a completely new system. But you know what? That new system's not ready to go either. It was supposed to be coming online next year. That's been delayed again. So our solution was to just not bother checking those EU imports. Problem is, this means a competitive advantage for EU businesses over ones from the rest of the world. And that was fine when we were in the single market because we had a treaty which covered it. All legal and above board, that was it, it's fine. But now we don't. We don't have a treaty for this. Like I said, you know, we don't have a treaty for free trade with the EU, just largely tariff-free trade, which is not the same thing. At some point, other major economies might decide that they need to stand up for their own export businesses and take action against the UK through the World Trade Organization. However, this hasn't happened yet. But then there's the problem for us, because we might not really care about giving the EU preferential treatment if the rest of the world isn't all that bothered, and it's certainly not a priority for them right now. You know, the EU have got high standards and we want their stuff, despite what the gammons claim. But the other problem that both Liz Truss highlighted last year and this report highlights again now is smuggling. It argues that the government needs to introduce import controls to prevent smuggling, and so actually it said to prevent smuggling and illicit activity. So I thought it was an odd way to phrase it. I'm sure there's some distinction, but isn't smuggling by definition illicit? But anyway, wording aside, the consequence of our very open border is that we are now a prime target for smuggling. It would be ridiculous to suppose that smuggling activity has not massively increased this past year, and the consequence of this is having our market flooded with counterfeit goods that also avoid tariffs. Double blow. So we get goods that aren't the real thing, and the Treasury misses out on any tariffs due, which is basically taxes used to pay for our public services. And I know one concern raised before Brexit specifically was the possibility of counterfeit medicines getting into the country. Like, if something's counterfeit, it may just be that it's not the real thing. It may be actively harmful. I mean, smuggling is just really easy at the moment. You just label your consignments as containing certain products that should get through no problem. If there's no risk of them being checked, you can bring in whatever you like. And when the government announced indefinite extensions to the import controls, that will have inevitably made smugglers even more interested. Like, at a time when they thought they might have 6 months to make hay, it was fine. Well, now there's more long-term potential here. There's currently no sign from the government that the import controls will ever come in. I mean, they will have to at some point. But even a casual observer can see that we're not ready, and we're not going to be ready in the foreseeable future. I haven't seen anyone who knows about these things who's able to put on a date on when we're likely to be able to do this. If we try and force the checks before we're ready, we will significantly reduce the flow of goods into Britain. Now, that would be acceptable, but for two things. Firstly, we've already got shortages, right? Compounding those shortages is too politically costly for the government, as it would introduce suffering on a much larger scale than their support base will tolerate. Secondly, it will expose the damage that their hard Brexit is doing. Same effect, loses the government political support for their actions. Now, if you were more than a casual observer, if you were a smuggler with, say, a professional interest, so to speak, you'd be looking at the situation as a massive opportunity for maybe the next couple of years. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.